Why does the church allow both priestly celibacy and priest marriages in the East? Doesn't the existence of both in one church show a contradiction? This is a really good question. So let's go to St. Augustine's Epistle 36. Okay, so there was a controversy in the early church. I would suggest actually you read, if you're really interested, you read this entire epistle about fasting on the Sabbath. So when it came to some places in the church, they fasted on the Sabbath, and then other places in the church they said no, actually it's a grave error for you to fast on the Sabbath. So Saint Augustine he refutes the work of an individual who said that it was per se sinful to fast on the Sabbath, and he goes through and refutes all their arguments. But really, what he shows in the midst of this letter is he makes a lot of comments on liturgical practical diversity in the church and the differences between various different practices and how each one of these practices don't show some sort of schism or fissure or division within the church. I mean, in this case and by this standard, even the pre-schism church would have had an internal disunity, because even in the pre-schism church there were various different practices. Some grades were allowed to be ordained while married, other grades were not allowed to be ordained while married. Some were allowed to be married but had to remain continent. Others were allowed to be married, and there was a later dispensation from the obligation to continence. In some areas, they didn't even ordain on any married men to certain degrees. So, I mean, um, it's not exactly right to even talk about two practices when it comes to continence in the early church. But basically, the idea that St. Augustine is going to bring forward is he's going to say, well, when it comes to some of these matters, there hasn't been a fixed law which has been given by our Lord or by the apostles. There hasn't been a fixed and universal law which has been written down in the scriptures of the New Testament. So, therefore, because of this fact, and because there hasn't been a universal determination, like, for example, the case of the date of Easter or something like that, because there hasn't been a universal determination by an ecclesiastical authority, because there's been nothing which has come down from the New Testament, from our Lord or from the apostles. Therefore, we're allowed to have liberty on this point, and one should follow the local custom, which is prevalent. Although, of course, this does not necessarily mean that any single custom is ideal, and there's no role of reform in the various different local customs. So this is what he says. He actually gives a personal example that he had with a conversation he had with Saint Ambrose of Milan. Let me see. I feel like there was a cooler statement that he made near. It's whatever. I'll just give the example from Saint Ambrose. He says, since therefore, as I've said above, we do not find in the Gospels or in the apostolic writings belonging properly to the revelation of the New Testament that any law was laid down as to fasts to be observed on particular days, and since this is consequently one of the many things difficult to enumerate, which make up a variety in the robe of the king's daughter, and this is talking about Psalm 45, Psalm 45 or 46, which make up the variety in the robe of the king's daughter, that is to say, of the church. I will tell you the answer given to my questions on this subject by the Venerable Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, by whom I was baptized. When my mother was with me in that city, I, as being only a catechumen, felt no concern about these questions. But it was to her a question causing anxiety, whether she ought, after the custom of our own town, to fast on the Saturday, or after the custom of the Church of Milan not to fast. To deliver her from perplexity, I put the question to the man of God, whom I have just named. He answered, what else can I recommend to others than what I do myself? When I thought that by this he intended simply to prescribe to us that we should take food on Saturdays, for I knew this to be his own practice, he, following me, added these words, when I am here, I do not fast on Saturday. When I am at Rome, I do. Whatever church you may come to, conform to its custom, if you would avoid either receiving or giving offense. This reply I reported to my mother, and it satisfied her, so that she scrupled not to comply with it. And I have myself followed the same rule. since however it happens, especially in Africa, that one church or the churches within the same district may have some members who fast and others who do not fast on the seventh day, it seemed to me best to adopt in each congregation the custom to those to whom authority in its government has been committed. Wherefore, if you are quite willing to follow my advice, especially because in regard to this matter I've spoken at greater length than was necessary, do not resist this. Do not resist your own bishop, but follow his practice without scruple or debate. So it's not necessarily that when it comes to various different practices within the church that there is contradiction. This doesn't involve necessarily some type of schism between the two. In the same way that if you have different rules for your 17-year-old child and your 7-year-old child, because you have different rules for different ages, different conditions, that doesn't mean that you somehow are contradicting yourself. The principles are the same. The doctrinal principles remain equal. It just has to do with different praxis.